Congressman John Lewis, who is Elwyn Wilson?
Elwyn Wilson is a man that I first encountered on May 9th, 1961 in Rock Hill, South Carolina at the Greyhound bus station. In 1961, I was part of the Freedom Ride. We left Washington, D.C. on May 4th, 1961, 13 of us, whites and blacks, to test a decision of the United States Supreme Court banning segregation in public transportation. My seatmate on that Greyhound bus from Washington, D.C., you must understand that in 1961, black people and white people couldn't be seated together when you got out of Washington to travel through Virginia, through North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. We were on our way to New Orleans. So we didn't have any problems for the most part until we got to Rock Hill. In a little place in Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte's not a little place, it's a sizable city. A young African-American man attempted to get a shoe shine in a so-called white barber shop that was in a so-called white waiting room. He was arrested and taken to jail. The next day, the jurors dismissed the charges against him. But when my seatmate, the two of us, arrived at the little Greyhound bus station in Rock Hill, South Carolina, a group of white men met us in the doorway and started beating us and left us lying in a pool of blood. And the local officials came up and wanted to know whether we wanted to press charges. We said no. We believe in love, in peace, in the way of nonviolence. I didn't know at the time, on May 9th, 1961, that this man was Elwyn Wilson. But years later, to be exact, in February '09, a month after President Barack Obama had been inaugurated, he came to my office on Capitol Hill with his son. His son had been encouraging his father to seek out the people that he had wronged. He walked into the office and said, "Mr. Lewis, I'm Elwyn Wilson. I'm one of the people that beat you. Will you forgive me? I want to apologize. I'm sorry." His son started crying. He started crying. I started crying. They hugged me. I hugged them back. And I saw him for the time since then. He recently passed. But it demonstrated the power of nonviolence, the power of love, the power of the way of peace to be reconciled.
Did he come to your office out of the blue?
He did not come to my office out of the blue. He had been for a time going around to different places in Rock Hill, South Carolina, trying to find students that had attended a local college, black college students during the sit-ins in 1960. He had gone around apologizing to them. And a local press person there, he made contact with in Rock Hill. He told him that he had beaten some of the Freedom Riders. So the press person started working with him and discovered that I was on the bus and that I was one of the people that was beaten. He said, "That man is John Lewis. He's in Washington. He's in the Congress." And so he made his way to Washington with his son.
Another significant date that you write about in Walking with the Wind, February 27th, 1960, Nashville, your first arrest. How did that come about?
I would never forget that day. I would never forget that day as long as I live. 20 years old. We had been involved in nonviolent workshops, studying the way of Gandhi, the way of Martin Luther King Jr. We had studied Thoreau and civil disobedience. We had what we call social drama, or role playing. And hundreds of students have been sitting in, and you'll be sitting there in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion, waiting to be served. And someone will come up and spit on you, or put a lighted cigarette out in your hair or down your back, or either just pour hot water, hot coffee on you, or pull you off the stool, or beat you. And we were sitting there in an orderly fashion, not saying a word, looking straight ahead, reading a book, working on a paper, and people started beating us. And the local police officials came up and arrested all of us, but not a single person that had been engaging in violence against us. That was my first arrest. And that day when I was arrested, I felt so free. I felt liberated. I felt like I had crossed over. Because growing up in rural Alabama, when I would ask my mother and my father, my grandparents and my great-grandparents about segregation and the racial discrimination, about those signs that I saw saying, white waiting, colored waiting, white men, white women, colored women. I said, why? And they would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way. Don't get in trouble. But Dr. King and Rosa Parks inspired me to get in trouble. So by sitting in, we were arrested and we went to jail. 89 of us were arrested on that day.
Did you pay a fine? Were you in jail for a while?
We were in jail for a few hours. Matter of fact, the local school officials came down and bailed us out. That was my first arrest. That was my introduction to southern jails. And I tell people, I grew up sitting down on those lunch counter stools and going to jail in places like Nashville and Birmingham, Jackson, Mississippi, Atlanta, Georgia, and a few other places across the South.
John Lewis, what was the ultimate result in Nashville prior to the larger civil rights movement?
The Nashville community became probably one of the first major cities in the American South to desegregate its lunch counters and restaurants. And a year later, desegregated all of its theaters. In Nashville, we started talking about the beloved community of making Nashville an open city. Nashville was considered the Athens of the South, and there was people in the white community, very progressive, really liberals, that really wanted to see Nashville make the great transition to a peaceful and open city.
How'd you get to Nashville?
I left rural Alabama in September 1957, 17 years old, traveling by bus to study. I wanted to attend a little school outside of Troy, Alabama, near where I grew up. I grew up 50 miles from Montgomery, 10 miles from Troy, and I applied to go to a school called Troy State College, now known as Troy University. I submitted my application, my high school transcript. I never heard a word from the school. So I wrote a letter to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He wrote me back and sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket, invited me to come to Montgomery to meet with him. But in the meantime, I'd been accepted at this little college in Nashville. So I went off to Nashville. Uncle of mine gave me a $100 bill, more money than I ever had, gave me one of these big upright foot lockers. I put everything that I owned in this foot locker, my books, my clothing, and went to Nashville. And I literally grew up in Nashville, because it was there that I started studying the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence.
Who were Shorty and Sugarfoot?
Shorty was a name that my mother and some other called my father, and my father would call my mother Sugarfoot. Yeah.
What did they do?
Well, they worked on a farm in 1944 when I was 4 years old, and I do remember when I was 4. I remember when I was 4. My father had been a sharecropper, a tenant farmer, but in 1944 he had saved $300. And with the $300, he bought 110 acres of land. My family still own that land today. And on this farm, we raise a lot of cotton and corn, peanuts, hogs and cows and chickens. And I would be out there some days working in the field, and I would say to my mother, "This is hard work, this is hard work." And she would say, "Boy, hard work never killed anybody." And I kept saying to myself, if I could just make it to the end of this row. And I complained. I said, working in the field like this is just like gammon. You spend all this money on fertilizer and plants and seeds, and sometimes you get too much rain and you don't know whether you're going to make anything